Hello. In this lecture, we'll talk about how to build expertise and enthusiasm through evaluation. You will recall that when we talked about the Ignatian classroom, we spoke of three important relationships that should be maintained. And one of these relationships is a relationship between the teacher and the world under investigation. Or in short, the relationship between the teacher and the content. And this relationship, ideally, should be characterized by expertise and enthusiasm. We've been discussing how Ignatian pedagogy can actually help us promote the 6 E's in the classroom. We've talked about how we can establish empathy through context, how we can strengthen engagement through reflection, how we can promote excellence through action. We've also talked about how we can build empowerment through experience. So in this talk, we will focus on how to increase teacher expertise and enthusiasm through evaluation. So first off, let's try to define what would teacher expertise look like. Usually people think that teacher expertise is equivalent to subject matter expertise. In short, the teacher should know what to teach. And that's really valuable because if the teacher is not familiar with the subject matter, if the teacher does not have a mastery of the subject matter, he or she will not be a very effective teacher. But aside from that, it's also important for the teacher to have some instructional expertise. The teacher may be a specialist in the content, in the subject matter, but if the teacher does not know how to teach, no matter how much subject matter expertise the teacher might have, he or she will still not be an effective teacher because if you don't know how to communicate what you know, then the students will not benefit. However, these are not the only components of teacher expertise. According to Schumann, there's a third component that we sometimes neglect, and this is called pedagogical content expertise or knowledge. What does pedagogical content expertise mean? It's the overlap between the subject matter expertise and the instructional expertise. So a teacher should have subject matter expertise, should be very familiar with the subject matter. The teacher should also know how to teach, should also have strategies, effective strategies to promote learning. But given a particular discipline, it's also important for the teacher to know how exactly to teach those concepts, those theories, those skills that belong to that discipline. In short, pedagogical content expertise differs from discipline to discipline. In summary, I would say that teacher expertise would have these three components: subject matter expertise, instructional expertise, but specific to the discipline, pedagogical content expertise. What about teacher enthusiasm? Well, here we're really talking about the Jesuit value of magis, a passion for excellence. Enthusiasm means to teach with passion, passion that will hopefully infect our students so that they too will develop their passion for the subject matter and the discipline. Enthusiasm is also about teaching with fire, in the hope that our students themselves will catch fire and also fall in love with the subject matter and the discipline. I've heard of many stories of people who pursued teaching because they were infected by the passion and the enthusiasm of their teachers. Now, teacher enthusiasm, I think, is possible only if for you, teaching is not just a means of livelihood. If for you, teaching is not just a career. I think for enthusiasm to be possible, for you, teaching must be a vocation. It must be a mission. It must be a source of meaning of life. If teaching for you is not also a source of the meaning of your life, if teaching is not also for you a vocation or a mission, I think it will not be very easy to exude the enthusiasm that's so valuable in our classes. Once again, here we have the diagram that summarizes Ignatian pedagogy. We have the three elements of experience, reflection, and action. We'll be focusing on evaluation. So let's recall what evaluation means. We've said that evaluation should be data-based. In evaluation, we have to make sure that the learning that happens in class can be monitored and, if necessary, can be redesigned. In evaluation, teacher and student monitor the learning that happens or not. and take time to review and adjust the plans. Now, it's important to note that ideally, it's both the teacher and the students who should be conducting the evaluation, not just the teacher. The students should also have their say, and their feedback is often valuable. So far, we've discussed how to define learning, we've discussed how to design learning. Here in evaluation, we'll be focusing on how to refine learning, how to improve learning, because that's the purpose of evaluation. And to be able to do that, teachers are encouraged to engage in reflection on practice. Reflective practice is a very common term today. It's a very fashionable term today. So it's important for us to just unpack what reflective practice means. For our purposes, reflective practice means reviewing the learning and teaching that goes on in the class. So the teacher should focus her attention on reviewing the learning and teaching. That would be an important form of reflective practice. And what's the purpose of this review? What's the purpose of this reflective practice? In order to redesign the teaching if necessary, in order to refine the learning, in order to increase the learning. And this redesigning of the teaching and refining of the learning should be based on the feedback that the teacher is able to acquire during his or her review of the learning and teaching. Now, some years ago, there was an important book that was published. The book was called How People Learn. And the book offers us 4 principles that can be guidelines on how people learn, and they can also serve as criteria when we review the learning and teaching. And some of these criteria might sound familiar to you already. So the first, it should be contextualized in previous knowledge. Secondly, the learning should be constructed rather than instructed. In other words, the learner should be active. Third, the learning happens because of the connections and organization under a conceptual framework. And fourth, the learning must be capable of transfer. Now, I'm sure these 4 principles sound familiar to you by now because we've made an effort to connect each one of them to the elements of Ignatian pedagogy. For example, context is all about contextualizing in previous knowledge, although part of context also includes the current mood of the students as well as their interests and their learning preferences and styles. Experience is about making sure that students are not just being instructed, but are doing the actual constructing. We want our students to be empowered when we design the learning experiences. When we talked about reflection, we spoke of how we need to guide our students and facilitate the process of the students connecting and organizing what they've learned in a conceptual framework. And finally, action, of course, is all about transfer of learning. So here are 2 big ideas here. The first is that Ignatian pedagogy is very much in sync with the 4 principles of how people learn. This is based on the latest educational research. And secondly, what's important here is that we can actually use the 4 principles as the basis for our evaluation, as the basis for our review of the learning and teaching that happens. If we keep in mind these 4 elements of Ignatian pedagogy, context, experience, reflection, and action, in a way, each one of them can serve as a criterion for the review of learning that we want our teachers to do in evaluation. Now, for us to be able to do evaluation and to make sure that it's database, we need to understand assessment of learning in contrast to assessment for learning. Many educationalists today make a distinction between the two. And basically, assessment of learning refers to summative assessment. The purpose of this kind of assessment is to find out how much the students have learned. So it's really summative assessment. Assessment for learning, on the other hand, is all about formative assessment. We do assessment in order to promote more learning. So we can actually use 2 teacher roles to represent assessment of learning and assessment for learning. The traditional role of the teacher as inspector represents assessment of learning, while on the other hand, the role of the teacher as coach for action would represent assessment for learning. Now, both assessment of learning and assessment for learning are important. We're not proposing that we do away with assessment of learning. Both summative assessment and formative assessment have their place. But one additional note we can make here is that we can also make formative use of summative assessment. The grades that our students get and all the other data yielded by our summative assessments can guide us in making decisions whether we need to redesign the teaching in order to refine the learning, in order to promote more learning. So let's not waste the data yielded by our summative assessments. So the big idea here is we can actually practice assessment for learning even if what we're conducting is assessment of learning. Our assessment of learning, our summative assessments, can also be assessment for learning, can also be used for formative assessments. So what are the different ways that a teacher can use in order to evaluate the learning and teaching in his or her class? First of all, the teacher can self-evaluate. After every class, the teacher can reflect on her practice and evaluate what went on in the class. So teacher self-evaluation is a valuable practice. Of course, we've already talked about summative and formative assessments. We can use summative assessments and formative assessments for assessment for learning. One powerful way of engaging in evaluation is to invite your colleagues or your supervisor to conduct classroom observations. In short, you open up your classroom and you invite your colleagues or your supervisor to come in, watch you in action, and give you feedback. What are your strengths? What are the areas that need to be improved on? And finally, let's not forget student feedback. Our students should be front and center in the learning that happens in the classroom. And for that reason, they would be a valuable source of feedback. We can learn so much about their learning and also about our teaching if we can ask them for feedback. So, evaluation can be conducted also among our students. And there are two ways of doing this. The first is self-assessment. We can invite our students to reflect on the learning that has happened and to ask themselves what were the things that facilitated their learning and what were the things that got in the way. You may recognize this to already be the metacognitive level of reflection. So you can create an opportunity for your students to engage in metacognitive reflection when they focus on the learning that happens, what helped them, and what hindered the learning. We can also invite the students to assess their peers, not only in terms of the outcome of the learning or the quality of the work of their peers, but also in terms of the process. Were the peers helpful in facilitating learning? So these are the different questions we can ask our students when we invite them to engage in peer assessment. But of course, to be able to assess properly, whether it's done by the teacher or the student for himself or for the peers, it's important to have rubrics. Now, what are rubrics? Rubrics serves as the basis for feedback giving. The feedback is very important. But if the feedback is not helpful, if it's not useful, then what's the point of doing it? So the rubrics will define what kind of feedback we're looking for and what kind of feedback will be helpful. So the rubric specifies the important criteria and standards. So for example, in a particular student task, what are some of the areas we need to examine to be able to assess the quality of the student's work? At the same time, what are the standards for this criteria? What does excellent work look like? So the rubrics also defines what an exemplar looks like. So rubrics can really guide us in terms of what to look for in a product or performance, but also in terms of how to judge the quality of the product or performance. In short, the rubrics will be the basis for the feedback that we will give our students that hopefully will lead to more learning. One approach to evaluation comes from Eisner when he talks about the educator as connoisseur and critic. According to Eisner, connoisseurship is the art of appreciation. It's the art of naming and seeing. A teacher must be able to name the different dimensions of what happens in class, to see these different dimensions, but also to see their relationships and how they affect one another. But connoisseurship, according to Eisner, is not enough. It's also important for the teacher to be a critic. According to him, effective criticism functions as the midwife to perception. In short, we need criticism to be able to see what more can be done, what else is missing. This combination of connoisseurship and criticism will enable the teacher to decide how to redesign the teaching in order to refine the learning. I'd like to mention here one of my favorite books, The Reflective Practitioner by Donald Shawn. The subtitle is How Professionals Think in Action. One of the gems in this book is his distinction between what he calls reflection on action and reflection in action. Reflection in action is what we've been talking about in evaluation, when the teacher looks back and reviews what happened in the class. So to reflect on what happened, to learn from the feedback, and to design and implement the response. That's basically what evaluation is all about. But the other point he makes here is reflection in action, in contrast to reflection on action. When he says reflection in action, he's talking about what teachers actually do all the time in the class, to think on their feet. So I guess the point I'm trying to make here is that evaluation need not be a post-mortem activity. It need not be conducted after the fact. It's possible to evaluate even during the class. So this really is something that teachers are already doing probably intuitively. But it's good for us to be more mindful that part of being a reflective practitioner is to be able to engage in reflection and action after the event, after the class, but also to engage in reflection in action during the class. And when you think about it, this is what an Ignatian educator is really invited to do, to be a contemplative in action, to be able to think on their feet, to reflect on their feet, to contemplate on their feet, and be able to make decisions that need to be made right there and then. So our discussion and evaluation sort of caps our series on Ignatian pedagogy. So this will be a snapshot of Ignatian pedagogy with the 5 elements of context, experience, reflection, action, and evaluation. I hope you were able to understand better and appreciate what each of these elements means so that you can also practice them more in your class. At the same time, I also hope you were able to appreciate how these 5 elements of Ignatian pedagogy can strengthen the Ignatian classroom in terms of promoting empathy, empowerment, engagement, excellence, and teacher expertise and enthusiasm. If you remember, 2 ideas we proposed at the outset is that learning by refraction, or Ignatian pedagogy, can help strengthen the Ignatian character of our Jesuit schools and universities. But at the same time, it can also actually promote 21st century learning. But this proper practice of Ignatian pedagogy will not be possible without the teacher's commitment to increasing expertise and enthusiasm. So evaluation is really an important element in Ignatian pedagogy. It is evaluation that will make possible the improving practice of Ignatian pedagogy. Without this magis, without the teacher's commitment to building their expertise on Ignatian pedagogy and their enthusiasm for it, I'm afraid we'll not be able to achieve those goals. So I'm hoping that you will be willing to do the work to learn more about Ignatian pedagogy as well as to spread enthusiasm for it among your colleagues. Thank you.